All right, good afternoon. We want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and the Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors. From north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Kitanamuk, Serrano, Cahuilla, Peonkawicham, Bahashiman, Ipai Tipai, Kumeyaay, and Quechua peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of these lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement, you can visit the land acknowledgement authored by the USC Van Hennick History Department. We invite you to visit their website, which we'll put in the chat. And for those of you joining us online, we also love to know where you're tuning in from, so feel free to let us know in the chat as well. My name is Janice Yu, and I'm the Shy Academic Relations and Outreach Officer of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. I'm delighted to welcome those of you here in person and those of you joining us on Zoom. So just a couple of quick notes about Zoom protocols for our online audience. Right now, you're viewing a side-by-side view of the speaker and the slides we're sharing. You can make either window larger or smaller by dragging the dividing line between the two windows left or right. We'll have time for questions and discussion following the lecture, so we encourage you to ask them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but we'll also share the chat and the Q&A with Anna, so if you have questions that weren't asked, she'll still be able to see them. We ask that you keep your engagement respectful to the speaker and other attendees. So now to introduce today's lecture and our speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Martha Stewart.
Thank you so much, and welcome to those of you in person and those of you joining on Zoom. And thank you to Janice and to Autumn for all your work behind the scenes in preparing for the event. And we'd also like to thank the Interactive Media and Games Division of the USC School of Cinematic Arts, who is our co-sponsor for this lecture. We very much appreciate your support. And because I suspect there's a new audience joining us for this lecture, I just want to introduce the center to you briefly. The Center for Advanced Genocide Research is dedicated to advancing new areas of interdisciplinary research that draws on the unique resources at USC on the Holocaust, genocide, mass violence, and resistance. These resources include the Holocaust and Genocide Studies book collection, the special collections at USC libraries, and the Visual History Archive. If you take a look at our YouTube channel, which I encourage everybody to do, and please subscribe while you're there, you can see the wide range of topics, geographies, cultures, and episodes of genocide, mass violence, and racial terror that our scholars have focused on since our founding almost 12 years ago. This semester's lectures are no exception. There's a lot of breadth to our many events. Interdisciplinarity is one of the core features of the center, one of our core values, and we're proud to have welcomed scholars from over 70 academic disciplines to the center. In addition to fields that one might normally associate with the study of the Holocaust and mass violence and genocide, we are proud to have supported research by fellows who conduct research to inspire or inform original creative works, including film, poetry, literature, and visual art. And to us, the research we're highlighting today follows in that tradition. So today we're here for the lecture of one of two 2026 Charles E. Scheidt Summer Undergraduate Research Fellows. This fellowship enables two undergraduate students from any university in the world to spend 2 months at the center each summer to work with the unique resources at USC for a research project of their own design. We offer our deepest thanks to Charles E. Scheidt, and the Charles E. Scheidt Family Foundation, whose generosity has had a profound impact on our center, opening up new avenues for undergraduate and graduate student scholars at and beyond USC. This summer, today's speaker was part of a cohort of 6 undergraduate and graduate student fellows and residents who were all studying a wide variety of genocides, asking a wide variety of questions, and all from different disciplines. I should mention that the second Scheidt Summer Undergraduate Research Fellow has her lecture next week. So please join us on Zoom for that. That will be next Wednesday at noon. And it is about competing narratives during, before, during, and after genocide. If you are an undergraduate student who is watching this talk and you feel intrigued or curious or inspired by the prospect of doing your own research, or if you're a faculty member who knows students who might be interested, the Scheidt Summer Undergraduate Research Fellowship is open for applications now, and you can learn more on our website. And if you have any questions, just email us and we're happy to consult with you about potential projects. So now to our speaker for today, who I'm very excited to introduce. Anna Hunter is the 2025 Charles E. Scheidt Summer Undergraduate Research Fellow. She is currently a third-year student at USC, pursuing a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Game Development and Interactive Design with a minor in video game programming. Anna has an impressive background in photography, digital media, game design, and poetry. She was named Memphis's first Youth Poet Laureate and Tennessee Youth Poet Laureate runner-up. She has her own freelance photography business, and many of her photographs have appeared in the Daily Trojan. She has worked on several game development teams, to put it mildly, as narrative designer, game artist, lead game artist, and producer. At the Game Developers Conference in 2024, she won the Gold Award in Narrative Competition for a video she created to analyze the video game Venba. She and her teammates were recently awarded first place in PlayStation Career Pathways Ratchet It Up Game Jam after designing and developing a walkthrough of a fantasy horror game called Mel in Space. Congratulations on that. Please join me in welcoming Anna Hunter.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for being here, everybody. Okay. I have never been one for a gradual introduction. I honestly prefer throwing people into the deep end, which, given what today is about, is a little on the nose. But before I do that, I want to take a moment. Today, I'll be covering topics that are incredibly sensitive: histories of atrocity, intergenerational trauma, racial violence, and the long aftermath of systems that failed the people they were supposed to protect. If at any point you need to step outside, stop watching, or just pause, please do that. You don't have to explain. Please take care of yourself. I also want to take a moment before I get into the weeds to say thank you, genuinely, not just as a formality. Thank you to the USC Center for Advanced Genocide Research and to the Charles E. Scheidt Summer Fellowship, which made this game-making process possible and also gave me a community of people who take this work so very seriously. Thank you to Martha, Janice, and Autumn for your guidance, for your patience, and your unwavering support. Working with you this past summer has changed the direction of this project in more ways that I'm still discovering. Thank you to my grandparents, all of them, for giving me their time and their trust, for letting me sit with them and ask questions that were not always easy to answer. This work would not exist without them. And thank you to every testimony and every researcher whose work I've drawn from and built upon. There are many people I will name throughout this talk, but I want to acknowledge that before anything else, this project is built on the shoulders of real lives, real histories, real legacies, and I do not take that lightly. Without further ado, let's get into it. There is a river in Mississippi called the Tallahatchie. In August of 1955, the body of a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till was pulled from that river. He had been beaten, he had been shot. A 75-pound cotton gin fan had been tied around his neck with barbed wire to keep him under. His face was so swollen and disfigured that his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, had to identify him by an initialed ring. She insisted on an open casket. She said, "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." The men who did it were acquitted in 67 minutes by an all-white jury. And then they went back to their lives. They went back to their shop, and the people who had to keep living around them, who had to pass that shop, who had to look those men in the eye, had no recourse, no appeal, and no justice coming. My grandfather was a boy in Drew, Mississippi when that happened. He saw the photographs, he heard the talk, and he passed by Roy Bryant's shop. I didn't know how much of that he carried until I asked him in February of last year. I sat down with a recorder and I called my grandfather, Robert Hunter, and I asked him to tell me what he remembered. And when I asked how he felt watching those men go free, he paused and then he said, "I never really thought about that." 6 words. And I've been thinking about those 6 words ever since, because that was not indifference, that was not forgetfulness, that was a man who had learned early and thoroughly that in a world where justice was not coming, emotional detachment was a survival strategy. His parents had taught him, keep your head down, work hard, follow the status quo, dream quietly. Don't give them a reason. That's intergenerational trauma. Not always the story told out loud, often the story that gets quietly handed down through what is not said. But I want to be careful here because I think there's something important to name before we go any further. This talk is about trauma, and it will stay close to the subject, but trauma is not the only thing that gets inherited. My grandfather is an educator. At this very moment, he is probably teaching English in Mississippi. His parents were educators. That love of learning, that belief in the power of passing knowledge on, that is also inherited. That also flows downstream. And you'll have to bear with me with the water puns today. When I ask myself why I'm standing here, making games about history, trying to translate testimony into something that a stranger can feel, I think part of that answer is that I come from a family of people who believed, even when the world gave them every reason not to, that teaching someone something was an act of care. That's not nothing, and that's everything to me. So when I talk about what gets passed down, I do mean all of it. The silence, the vocation, the caution, and the calling. History does not only wound. Sometimes when the people carrying it are extraordinary, it also instructs. My name is Anna Hunter. As Martha said, I am a game development and interactive design major at the University of Southern California, minoring in video game programming. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, about 2 hours from Drew. And this talk is about what happened when a game designer sat down with that history and asked, what would it look like to make someone feel this? Not read about it, not study it, feel it. I want to tell you about 2 games. One that I spent a summer building and ultimately had to reimagine, and one that is still becoming itself. I want to tell you about my research, about the people I interviewed, about the testimonies I sat with in the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, and I want to be honest with you about the challenges of translating grief and silence and injustice into something interactive, without flattening it, without making it a lesson when it deserves to be an experience. I also need to say this up front, which Martha also covered. I am a poet. I know that sounds like an odd thing to say in a game design talk that's coupling genocide research, but it matters. I wrote a paper in my advanced writing course called To Be a Poet. And the argument I made was that as a poet is someone who is incapable of finishing the things they create because things always resurface. There is always more. Lois Lowry in her Newbery acceptance speech said that there are other rivers flowing. We learned that in 7th grade, and this thought has never left me. The rivers are unending. That is a poet's dilemma. Incomplete, but not in the negative. Never in the negative, because history is the same way. It is not finished. It keeps flowing. It finds you, just as it found me. So this is my table of contents for today, and we're just going to go dive right into the research. That's another one. All right. In the spring of my sophomore year, I enrolled in JS 211, the Holocaust taught by Professor Wolf Gruner. I'll be honest, my knowledge was largely dependent on what I learned in 7th grade. I wanted to go deeper, and what I found was one of the most formative courses I had taken at USC. We wrote a research paper on any topic pertinent to the Holocaust. I had a list of ideas. I knew I wanted to explore something at the intersection of Black and Jewish history. That relationship has always interested me. The parallels, the divergences, the places where the two histories speak to each other across time. I went to office hours with my TA, Grace Schaefer, and while I was waiting, something clicked. Well, actually, another student came and talked to me, and I can't remember what he said, but I was like, oh my gosh, my grandfather, Drew, Mississippi, Emmett Till, the shop, the acquittal. That was my question. My paper is titled Perpetrators Free, Victims in Perpetual Bondage, Memory and Resistance Across Black and Jewish Histories of Persecution. And the central argument is this: how has the failure to hold perpetrators accountable shaped generational trauma and perceptions of justice in Black and Jewish communities? Let me walk you through what I found briefly, because it lives in both games. First, we're going to start off with the law as architect. We think of the law often as a response to injustice, but of course, in the Jim Crow South and Nazi Germany, law was the injustice. It didn't permit racial and ethnic violence, it constructed it. It gave it legitimacy and permanence. One of the earliest Jim Crow laws in Tennessee, and one that is actually cited as the first, is the Chapter 130 Acts of Tennessee from 1875. They explicitly permitted business owners to discriminate in hotels, theaters, streetcars, railroads based on race. It didn't just segregate, it criminalized Black public presence through economic exclusion and made that criminalization official. It told a community, you're not a full person here, which we've seen remnants of before, but crucially, it made racial violence routine by embedding it in the everyday structure of civic life. What stopped me cold in my research was discovering the connection between these American laws and Nazi racial legislation. Scholar James Whitman documents in Hitler's American Model that Nazi legal theorists actively studied American segregation statutes, anti-miscegenation laws, and voter suppression tactics as precedents for their own racial laws. They found the United States, and you gotta really sit with this, because when I first read this, I was like, oh, this is, wow, okay, at the forefront of creating second-class citizenship. They admired it. They used it as a model. And this one detail that I cannot shake is that even the Nazis found the American one-drop rule excessively harsh. For the architects of the Holocaust to look at American racial law and say, that goes too far, that tells you something about the depth of what was built here. In both systems, the law was not reflecting society's prejudice solely. It was manufacturing it, seeding it, ensuring that injustice would not need to be enforced by individuals. It would simply be the water everyone swam in. Then we have survival as resistance. The second thing I found moved me in a different way. In the absence of formal justice, survival itself becomes defiance. Once again, Wolf Gruner in Resistors broadens the definition of resistance to include any individual or group action in opposition to known laws, actions, or intentions of the Nazis and their collaborators. By that definition, resistance is not just armed uprising, it is the daily choice to remain. My grandmother, Mildred Woodson, was born in Memphis in 1938. She was light-skinned enough to pass for white her entire life, and I promise these photos don't do her justice. When we were younger, my little cousins would always be like, Anna, is our grandma white? So I do preface that, but when I asked her why she never did, she looked at me and she said, and I quote, I didn't want to. 5 words if you count as one, but her identity was non-negotiable. In a system that would have rewarded her erasure, she chose visibility. That is resistance. Hedwig Jastrow was a 76-year-old woman in 1938 who took her life rather than be assigned a Jewish name by the Nazi state. In her note, she wrote that every convict, every murderer keeps his name. And she refused to be renamed by a regime that had already decided who she was. Where my grandmother resisted by being seen, Jastrow resisted the violent imposition of a false identity. Both women claimed a personhood that the law sought to take from them. And Yehuda Bauer says plainly, the determination to survive in defiance of genocidal authority is in itself an act of resistance. That framing validates the quiet choices, the ones that never made it into textbooks. And then my last key point for my essay was trauma transmitted through silence. The third thread is the one that connects everything, and the one that became the emotional engine of both games. Fred Rodell was a Jewish interrogator at the Nuremberg trials. In a 1999 USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive testimony, He described growing numb during the proceedings. He said that it became just like another job. And then 50 years later, he read back through the records and he was, in his own words, flabbergasted. The emotion came flooding back because desensitization does not erase memory, it just buries it. And buried things surface when safety finally allows. And I'm going to briefly show a clip from that interview.
Let me tell you, when I first got to Nuremberg and listened to all this stuff, the first few months I couldn't sleep at night because I used to see all these things that they did in my sleep, like these experiments that they did, how they used to pester people and mutilate people willingly. And it bothered me to no end. But then you just got used to it. It was just like another job. It didn't bother me anymore. And you listen to these things every day. And in fact, some of the stuff I read just before you got here, and I was flabbergasted. I know I heard it every day, and now I didn't hear it for some time, and it bothered me again. I was thinking of it last night in bed.
I really think that drives the point home of the trauma's transmission through silence, but I do have another clip that I want to show from Mona Golombek, whose mother survived the kinder transport. She gave a Shoah Foundation interview in 2022, describing how her mother never told her what she felt on the train, never described the psychic wound, as she puts it. Rather, Golombek had to go into her own heart to imagine it. She didn't inherit the story, she inherited the silence and filled it herself.
From the Kindertransport, her experience, her journey.
She never spoke to me really about many specifics of what happened on the train. I know some things. I know about the inspections. I know about a baby that was pushed into the train ride and how she protected that baby, somewhat from a Nazi officer. She never, though, described really her emotions or what she was feeling in her heart. So I kind of had to go in my own heart to imagine the psychic wound. I can't even imagine a train pulling away from everything that you know, everything that you love. Waving desperately in a sea of humanity. People just waving.
I knew that experience before I ever heard her say it, because that's exactly what happened when I tried to interview my grandmother, Shirley Hunter. Every time I brought up her early life, her move to the South, she redirected. She let the conversation fall quiet. Her silence was testimony. What she didn't say structured my understanding of what she'd been through. I had to read her pauses like a text. Researchers Bowers and Yehuda confirm this pattern. Trauma is transmitted not just genetically, but behaviorally, through caregiving patterns, emotional modeling, the atmosphere of a household. Children learn to carry what they were never handed directly. They just feel the weight of it. When perpetrators go free, when the law fails, when, oh, sorry, Grandma, I gotta do you justice. She's pictured right here in the center, and of course, this is my grandfather, and that's my little dad right there. But when perpetrators go free, when the law fails, when no accountability comes, survivors are left to adapt. Silence becomes a strategy, caution becomes an inheritance, and generations downstream carry something they were never told. They just know, somehow, to be careful, to be quiet, to keep moving. This is a brief look at my research, and now I want to tell you what I tried to do with it. I spent the summer of 2025 as a fellow at the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And the question I came in was, how do you turn testimony into something playable? How do you take the weight of what Fred Rodell and Mona Golombek and my grandparents carried and make someone else feel it and not just receive it? I was inspired by Lucas Pope's Papers, Please, which is pictured at the bottom left here, of the mood board I made when I first came to the fellowship. And Papers, Please is a game that he made essentially solo in about 9 months, where you play as an immigration officer at a border checkpoint in a fictional Soviet-era country. You stamp documents, you follow rules, you make life and death decisions in a system designed to make you complicit before you realize it. It is one of the most morally devastating games that I've played, and it does it entirely through bureaucracy. I was also thinking about a game described in Gabrielle Zevin's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, where a character named Sadie builds a game set in a Nazi armament factory. Only you don't know it's a Nazi armament factory until you keep playing. So the player slowly realizes that they've been building weapons for the war effort, and then you can decide whether you're going to be a saboteur or if you're going to be complicit. The horror in this game is in the ordinary. It's what you do when you don't fully understand what you're a part of. Then there's also Not for Broadcast, which is a narrative-driven propaganda simulation set in an alternate 1980s where a radical government is rising to power. You control the national nightly news, mixing camera feeds, rolling ads, and bleeping swears under the pressure of a live broadcast. What you put on air shapes people's lives, literally, but you still get paid either way. So these games share something. They make you complicit before you really know you are. And that felt right. So I developed the archive. The archive's premise is that you're a sole archivist in a memory preservation system. Files come across your desk, and you have 3 choices. Archive, preserve the file with the system monitoring. Amend, alter the narrative to align with what the system wants. Erase, bury it entirely, remove it from accessible memory. The idea here was that there was a limitation based on how many files you could keep every day, so you had to get rid of something. It's simple on the surface, devastating in practice, because the files are not invented, they are rooted, every single one of them, in the research that I just walked you through. And I want to take you inside that connection because that's where the archive became something more than a game concept to me. It became a translation problem, a moral problem, and eventually an honest reckoning with what I was actually trying to do. Okay. So let's start with Fred Rodell. In the game, his testimony appears, this is just an image of what the core loop looked like in a very early test of the archive. So we're going to start with Fred Rodell. In the game, his testimony appears as a wartime document formatted inside the archive's bureaucratic interface, stamped with a file type given a moral flag by the CRT. The system wants to know, is this compliant? Does it support the narrative we're maintaining? And what Rodell's testimony does in the real world and in the game is refuse easy categorization. Because here is a man who was present at Nuremberg, inside the machinery of justice, and still felt nothing, or felt numbed into nothing. And then 50 years later, reading the records again, he was overwhelmed. The emotion had not gone, it had waited. The delayed resurgence, that's not a legal document, that's not a resolved case, that's a man whose grief had nowhere else to go in a system he was serving. The archive asks you, do you preserve that, flag it for monitoring, or amend it, make it tidier, less destabilizing? Because an interrogator who went numb doesn't fit the story of a justice system that worked. Then there's Mona Golubeck. Her testimony in the game appears as a family memory, an interview, a genre that the archive system flags as variable, meaning it could go either way. It could be compliant if the official narrative, it could be compliant if it confirms the official narrative, non-compliant if it doesn't. Golubeck's account, the way she describes inheriting her mother's silence, that psychic wound, it's not variable, it's specific. And it's the exact shape of an inheritance that comes without a name. Once again, Bowers and Yehuda call this intergenerational transmission of stress, the behavioral, relational passing of trauma through caregiving patterns rather than just explicit storytelling. The archive system cannot process that nuance. It just sees family interview, variable, file it. Hedwig Jastrow appears as a personal letter. In the archive's interface, her suicide note, the one from 1938, becomes a flagged artifact. Resistance, non-compliant. Think about what that means. A 76-year-old woman chose death over a forced renaming by the Nazi state. She wrote that every convict, every murderer keeps his name. She refused to become who the regime insisted she was. And in the archive, the system looks at her choice and says, not compliant. Flag it, decide what to do. That's not a game mechanic I invented. That is the logic of every system that has ever tried to erase a person's resistance by reclassifying it as instability, as a threat, as something that needs to be managed rather than honored. Gruner's expanded definition of resistance becomes the interpretive framework the archive is constantly testing. because the system in the game does not recognize quiet resistance. It does not recognize survival as defiance. It recognizes compliant and non-compliant. And anything that doesn't fit its moral rule set gets flagged, amended, or buried. My grandmother, Mildred Woodson, choosing not to pass, the archive would look at that family interview and not know what to do with it. Is it visibility resistance or destabilization? The system can't quite answer that. Only a human can. And the game is asking, what do you do with that gap? Whitman's argument about American racial law as a Nazi model becomes a legislative document in the game, formatted to look like an official statute, dry and procedural, the exact aesthetic of something that wants to be read as neutral. The system flags it, hierarchy maintenance, compliant. Because of the archive, a law is a law. It does not know that this law was used as inspiration for genocide. It does not know that transnational horror embedded in its structure. It just sees legislation. File accordingly. And my grandfather's words, his family interview, based on what he actually said to me in February of last year, appear in the game as flagged, variable, compliant, or non-compliant. You got to sit with that for a minute. A man who grew up in Drew, Mississippi, who passed the shop of a murderer who walks free, who said he had never really thought about that, who modeled survival and restraint so thoroughly that his entire emotional landscape on racial injustice was shaped by what he did not allow himself to feel. His voice in this system is a variable, because the archive does not know what to do with survival that looks like silence. It does not know how to flag the inheritance of caution. It can only ask, compliant or non-compliant, and wait for you to decide. Guiding you through all of this is a character called the CRT, which you saw in motion back there. It's a computer monitor, your interface, and your supposed guide. I designed it inspired by the computer in the attic from Courage the Cowardly Dog, which you saw on the left on the mood board. If you know that show, you know the computer, eerie, glowing, all-knowing, presents itself as helpful and rational, while doing something entirely different underneath. That's the CRT. Early in the game, it's neutral, moralistic, a little too encouraging. Mid-game, it starts contradicting itself, glitching, mimicking your language back at you. By the end, it's speaking outright in control language, choices irrelevant, filtration complete. Because the CRT is not your guide. It's a training and algorithm. It is watching every choice you make and building a moral model from you, learning how you think. At the end, it doesn't need you anymore. It sorts the files in your voice and makes decisions in your name, and it tells you, human discretion is no longer required. That's a metaphor for what happens when systems of memory and justice are automated without accountability. That's what happens when the story of harm gets processed instead of witnessed. And so, we got to talk about the ethical weight and where it led. I have to be honest with you, because the creative process is a part of what this talk is about. Every time I got to a good place with the archive, I would step back and think, this feels more like an instructional experience than a game. It was teaching, it was informing, but was it moving? Was it letting someone feel something, or just showing them something and waiting for a reaction? And I had deeper ethical concerns that went beyond the design, because when you take real testimonies like Fred Rodell's voice, Mona Golombek's inheritance, Hedwig Jastro's final letter, my grandfather's words, and you put them inside a game system that asks the player to sort them into an archive, to amend, to erase, you are doing something that requires serious scrutiny. You are asking the player to handle real grief as a mechanic. Even with the names changed, even with the fictional framing, even with the best intentions, you are still building a system that processes suffering as data. And the question I could not stop asking myself was, is that what I want to do with these people's lives? Is that what they deserve? I changed names, I fictionalized details, I worked with transformative educational frameworks, but the discomfort never fully resolved. And I think that discomfort is worth naming out loud in a room like this, because anyone working at the intersection of difficult history and interactive design is going to hit this question eventually. What does it mean to make someone play inside of somebody else's pain? When does interactivity become a form of handling? And when does it become witnessing? I don't have a clean answer. What I have is evidence that the question itself led me somewhere better. I brought the archive into my narrative design class in the fall. My professor, who is both sharp and direct, looked at the design and said, "You're playing with a lot of live wires here." He was right. I had 1 foot in a real historical world and 1 foot in a fictional one, and the seam was showing. He told me to step back rethink the world, find a way in that wasn't quite so exposed. And then something opened up. What if the history was still there? All of it. But the world around it was fully imagined. What if I built somewhere else entirely? Somewhere the player could enter without already knowing how the story ends. Let the truth arrive in a way it actually does in families, in fragments, slowly, at a great personal cost. What if it was underwater? So I have to preface, for the class, we were encouraged to use AI-generated images in order to create some sort of appearance for the game so that our professors would understand what the world would look like. And especially for a game like mine that takes place at an underwater air pocket at the bottom of the ocean with rivers floating overhead, it gets a bit... Okay, so I just want to preface that. So any slides using generative AI, there aren't many, but they are indicated at the bottom. But you can obviously tell. So where the world came from. The underwater setting is not arbitrary. It is rooted in the same history as everything else I've been talking about. When enslaved Africans went overboard during the transatlantic slave trade, when they jumped, when they chose the ocean over bondage, they went to the bottom of the water. That's a truth that still lives underwater. And across many traditions and communities, water carries memory. The sea remembers. Rivers hold the stories of people who have passed through them and over them and into them. And then there's the Tallahatchie, the river I opened this talk with, where Emmett Till's body was found. The same river my grandfather grew up near. The same river my great-grandfather took my father fishing in. That river connects 3 generations of my family in one of the most iconic cases of racial terror in American history. It's the same water. It holds all of it at once. Once again, Lois Lowry, in her Newbery acceptance speech, she said that other rivers are flowing. She was talking about literature, about the way stories keep going past the edge of the page, but she was also talking about something true. Rivers don't stop. Memory doesn't stop. They keep moving, keep carrying, keep arriving somewhere downstream. There's a song that plays in the second act of The Keep of the Currents. It exists inside the world of Yonder, an old record spinning on a record player in Cree's living room, Cree being my main character. We'll get into that in a moment. I wrote it as a reinterpretation of Strange Fruit, which was originally written in 1937 by Abel Meeropol, a Jewish man, a school teacher, writing about the lynching of Black Americans. That lineage matters to me. A Jewish man writing about anti-Black violence, his words becoming one of Billie Holiday's most devastating recordings, and then those words, the tradition, traveling into an underwater world I built to hold both of the histories at once. And that's what it sounds like in Yonder. Shallow reefs bear peculiar bloom, rust in the coral, bones in the moon, bodies adrift where the seaweed sways, names unspoken, lost to the waves. Cathedral hush of the waters keep, cities asleep in the blue so deep, salt on stone and prayers grown thin, currents whisper of what has been. Here is yield for the tides to claim, for the sunless depths that hide in shame, for the drift to cover, for time to choke. Here is the fruit, the surface broke. The song plays as Cree's world is beginning to fracture. She has already started to uncover the truth. She does not yet know how deep this corruption goes, which we'll also touch on, but the world is literally telling you, the player, something, and it tells you everything if only you would listen. I wrote those lyrics, but they're in conversation with something much older, and that conversation between Black history and Jewish history, between one man's grief in 1937 and the world I'm building now, is exactly what the entire project is about. Gabriel Garcia Marquez understood this. In 100 Years of Solitude, a plague of forgetfulness overtakes the town of Macondo. People began to forget the names of things and then even what the things do themselves. Garcia Marquez wrote this before people really began to understand this effect. He was writing about what happens to a people when they lose access to their own history, when forgetting is not a failure of memory, but a consequence of power. In the world I built, that forgetting is not a plague, it's a policy. The world of Yonder. The civilization is called Yonder, like the word yonder. Somewhere far off, somewhere you're always looking toward, yet never quite reaching. Somewhere else, elsewhere. Yonder is a city at the bottom of the ocean, enclosed in a massive air pocket, surrounded by a barrier that its people are taught will kill them if they cross. That belief is the first lie. It is what keeps the civilization contained. Above the city, memory currents form naturally, floating rivers of water suspended in the air, full of the histories everyone who has ever passed through the ocean above and has experienced and lived through. These currents eventually dissolve until they are brought into the underwater archive called the Keep. Only trained keepers, archivists, can draw them down safely using staffs that have been passed down through generations. It's an ancient technique. And there's also a ruling class. I do apologize for all the proper nouns, but I do have to get them out of the way. The ornery, spelled O-R-N-E-R-Y, I have a big thing about words and their meaning. So they carry symbolic staffs, but they cannot perform the technique. They never could. So they fear the keepers, but they also need them to maintain their history. The ornery maintain power through something called the fading, which is a direct reference to the plague of forgetfulness and 100 years of solitude. What the people of yonder believe is a disease, a terrifying spreading affliction that strips memory and eventually leaves a person in a vegetative state, is actually a compound. It's something that the ornery administer in order to maintain control over any dissenters. And something that Cree discovers in her time as an archivist, as a keeper, is that this is not even the first iteration of yonder. It's yonder 7. When revolts grow, the ornery administer the fading en masse, eliminate the dissenters, and then rebuild. The cycle has happened 6 times before. Nobody in yonder knows this because the people who knew were erased. It's not fantasy, it's history. That's what happens to this day. That's what happened in the Jim Crow South. That's what happened in Nazi Germany over and over. Systems that erase the people who challenge them and then write the history as though resistance never happened. So now we got to talk a little bit about Cree. So Cree, C-R-E-E, you play as her. She's young. She's the youngest person to ever pass the Keeper's trial in yonder's recorded history. She's driven by her family. She wants to provide for them, to prove herself, and to do it without asking for help. That last part's her flaw. The game's central lesson, for her and not just the player, is that memory work cannot be done alone. Healing intergenerational trauma cannot be done alone. Some truths require collective action. Her grandfather is fading, not from illness, but from the weaponized compound administered to him as a child when he crossed the barrier and survived, and saw what was outside, and came back knowing something that the ornery could not allow him to keep. He was 7 years old, not so unlike my grandfather when Emmett Till was killed in Drew. They erased it from him, and now, decades later, the compound is destabilizing, and so is he. Cree's trying to save his mind, and in doing so, she uncovers the one thing the ornery have been protecting for generations. I want to be careful about how explicit I get here because I think the parallels between Cree and me, between her grandfather and mine, are ones that I want the audience to feel rather than be told. But what I will say is this. I did not design a character who happens to have a grandfather with fading memories as a plot convenience, albeit my grandfather is still very sharp. I designed a character whose entire motivation is built around a man whose history was taken from him, and she will risk everything to give it back. That's personal. All right, how did the Keep of the Currents even become itself? When my narrative professor told me to rethink the world, I didn't immediately know what the Keep of the Currents was. I knew it was underwater. I knew memory had to be a physical thing, something you could dive into, not just sort. I knew I wanted a protagonist who had a physical presence, a name, a grandfather, a reason to keep going that wasn't just a moral obligation. The archive was asking players to sit at a desk and make choices about real history. The Keep of the Currents asks players to move through a living world where history is literally overhead, where the currents carry everything that has ever been lost. And the question is not what to do with it, but whether you are brave enough to dive in. That shift from bureaucratic moral sorting to embodied memory recovery was everything to me. It removed the didacticism I kept bumping up against with the archive. It let the research live inside of fiction instead of sitting on top of it. And then it also gave me room to build something that doesn't require you to already know about the Jim Crow South or the Holocaust to feel its weight. You just have to care about Cree and her grandfather and what it means to lose someone to silence that was forced on them. I also found my inspirations converging in ways that felt almost designed. The setting draws from the underwater world of Talokan in Black Panther Wakanda Forever, a civilization hidden beneath water formed by people who fled violence. South of Midnight, which is set in a fictional American Deep South and weaves memory, history, and trauma into something that still, despite everything, remains hopeful. The way that the game understands those things The pain, the resilience, the loss, the continuation are not opposites. They're the same story. The floating, dreamlike landscape of the flying waters in Clair Obscura Expedition 33. My game students might find that a bit funny. That game is everywhere. But then also there's the city of Ember, and of course, 100 Years of Solitude that I mentioned. The city of Ember, which is about a government that, lies to trap its citizens and calls it protection. All of these are works about hidden worlds, controlled knowledge, and what happens when you finally see past the barrier. And all of them understand something that I wanted the Keep of the Currents to understand too. The stories rooted in darkness don't have to end there. So let's get a little bit into the mechanics. So let me walk you through how the research is actually living in the mechanics, and then I'll put you inside a moment of it. Memory currents are the floating rivers overhead. They form naturally from the water above, carrying histories, testimonies, experiences from everyone who has ever been in the ocean. Cree draws them down into the keep using her staff, and then when she enters a current, she's not sorting a document. She's witnessing. She moves through someone else's lived experience in real time. The past is not a file, it's a place. Memory shards are the fragments she recovers in those currents. They are pieces of incomplete truths corrupted by the ornery's interference, bleeding across multiple lives, multiple currents. Cree collects them and brings them back. And this is where the most personal mechanic lives in grandfather's fragments. The two are very connected. Every shard she returns to her grandfather gives him a moment of clarity. He looks at her and knows her. He remembers something, and then it fades again. She's in a race, not against a singular villain exactly, but against time and erasure and the damage that was done to him before she was born. Conversation as conflict is a mechanic I'm particularly proud of. It's not something that's uncommon in games. In fact, it's very popular, but I think it works really well for the Keep of the Currents. Certain dialogue, like deeper truths, hidden evidence, the things that people in Yonder cannot say, is openly locked behind shard collection. You cannot access those conversations until you have done the work of recovering the past first. You have to earn the truth. That mirrors something that I consider to be pretty real. In survivor families, the stories don't just come out immediately. They come out after you've already been sitting with someone for a while, after you've proven that you're ready to hold it. Adaptive staff combat means that Cree responds to the shards she carries. As she recovers more memories, she gains new techniques, new resistance. Her growing understanding of history literally changes what she's capable of. The past makes her stronger. It's not just game design, it's kind of a thesis statement. And then you have the Keeper's technique, which is like an active drawing, stabilizing, and entering a current. It's the core fantasy of the game. It's ancient. The ornery cannot do it. Only trained keepers who are genuinely working with memory can. There's something I love about a game where the power that matters most is the witnessing, the power to witness. Now, a brief moment inside the game before we take this home. So let me put you in this moment. Imagine you are Cree. You are in a current or a river. You just dove in, one of the older, more corrupted rivers in the keep. You're moving through fragmented memory when the corruption bleeds, and suddenly you are witnessing something that's not part of the current you entered. You see a person, someone from an earlier Yonder, maybe generations back, standing before the ornery. They are being given a new name, an official name, a name that's not theirs, and they refuse. You watch them choose death rather than accept a name that erases who they were. You just heard me talk about Hedwig Jastrow. You know her note. You know she wrote that every convict, every murderer keeps his name. You know she was 76 years old when she chose her terms over the state's. In the game, you don't know any of that. You're just a person standing very still, and then you see a person standing very still. You see them make a choice, and then the memory goes dark. And you carry that shard back to Cree's grandfather. And for a moment, he's cleared. He looks at you, he says something, he remembers. And then the fading bells toll outside. You run to the window, and when you return to your grandfather, he doesn't know who you are. That's the game. That's what I'm trying to build in a very condensed version. Lastly, I also have this note from Ross Berger. It was a really cool point that I would love to include in the Keep of the Currents. I was having a conversation with Ross. He's a scholar, someone who works in the game industry. He's also an adjunct professor here. He suggested that the Keep of the Currents would benefit from a companion guide, a document of some sort that separates the game itself, that maps specific scenes and moments to their real historical parallels. For players who want to know what the naming current was really referencing, what the fading was modeled on, what the arc of Yonder 7 corresponds to in actual history. I love this idea for a specific reason. It preserves the choice. The game does not force the lesson. You can play the Keep of the Currents and feel something real without ever knowing the scholarship behind it. But the door is open if you want to walk through it. If you want to understand why a fictional character choosing death over the name of an underwater civilization, I'm sorry. If you want to understand, if you want to walk through it and understand why a fictional character choosing death over a name in an underwater civilization and why that's connected to a real woman in Berlin in 1938, then that door is there. That's the difference between didacticism and invitation. The archive was trying to do both at once and then collapsing under the pressure, and the Keep of the Current separates them and lets each one breathe. So why it matters. I want to end by telling you what I hope someone feels when they play the Keep of the Currents. I want them to finish and think, this is a topic I'd never really considered, and the fact that it still permeates to this day is pretty astounding. I want them to feel that weight, and then feel that they can carry it, because the game gave them a way in that didn't require them to already know the history, that didn't ask them to sit through a lecture, that didn't treat them like a student. It treated them like someone capable of feeling grief for people they'd never met, because that's what games can do that nothing else quite can. A paper makes an argument. A game makes you live inside one. When Cree returns Ashar to her grandfather and he looks at her and really looks at her, knows her name, remembers, and then the fading bells toll and she comes back and he is gone again, that's not information. That's grief. That's the specific part of grief of losing someone to a silence that was forced on them before you ever arrived. My grandmother Shirley has still not yet told me her story. My grandfather Robert said he had never really thought about watching men walk free after murdering a child. My grandmother Mildred said 5 words about one of the most defiant choices of her life, and then moved on. That is what I inherited. Not stories, not strategies. Silence shaped by a world that gave them no other option. I'm trying to make a game worthy of that inheritance. Once again, Lois Lowry said that there are other rivers flowing, unending. And in my work, in this research, in these games, and everything still becoming itself, I would like to think the same. The poet's dilemma, incomplete but not in the negative. History keeps flowing. Memory keeps arriving. And somewhere downstream, maybe a player will dive into a current and come back changed. We'll carry a shard back to someone who needs it. We'll stay in the credits a little longer than they expected, watching recovered memories drift through the water, and choose, when they are ready, to stop witnessing. And I hope they take their time. Thank you. Cool. You did it.
Anna, thank you so much. You can
I
stay
stay right here.
if you're comfortable with that.
Yes, I'm cool with that. Okay, let me slide.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Your work honors the research that you did, and I will open it up for questions. For those of you on Zoom, just a reminder to please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the window, and we'll take some questions.
Yes. Thank you so much for such a phenomenal lecture. It's been such a joy to hear about your research and just watch everything this has become. I wanted to ask you a question, unsurprisingly, about the archive. So when you're doing your research, you're using 2 very different archives, right? You've got the VHA, but then you've also got this family archive that you're curating. So I guess I was just wondering, how did you navigate both of these 2 very different archives? And I'm also curious, when you were conducting your own interviews and cataloging the information in this family archive, how were you approaching it differently or similarly to the interviewers and the archivists in the VA?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, it was a bit difficult, honestly, trying to catalog information from my grandparents' interviews because, one, I'm trying to record them while I'm on a phone call, and then the connection's also not the best. But then coupled with the fact that if I try to put it into something to transcribe the interview, it was not really understanding what my grandfather was saying. I mean, I feel like it's not that hard to understand his dialect at all, but the software did. And so that made it somewhat difficult. So I had to go in and I just transcribed it all myself. And so some of the VHA testimonies have like, of course, like the transcripts, and like you can go second by second and look through them there. And so when I was like trying to be mindful of how they categorize things, I really wanted to take note of like pauses, because I think pauses are so prevalent in these interviews, especially in the later interviews that like you saw with Mona Golombek. You see like they take note of specific instances like that. And so that's something that I really wanted to carry in. I also wanted to be mindful of not over interviewing and just letting the stories unfold, because my grandfather is such an orator. He the way he narrates stories is so interesting. Like when I first started interviewing him, I don't even remember what my first question was. He goes, I grew up in Drew, Mississippi, in the heart of segregation in America. And I was like, okay, Grandpa, you're about to write my essay for me. So I think it's just a really unique way to be able to look at both the VHA and then also at these family interviews and like try to categorize them in a similar way, so it makes it easier for me. Like timestamps. Oh, I'm so thankful I wrote down the timestamps when I was doing these things, because man, it made my life so much easier. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like really interesting thinking about how as well like the index in terms of the VHA versus the like the content and themes that are emerging from both those interviews and your family interviews as well. So yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you so
for the
much for the
question.
question.
Yay.
Yes.
I absolutely loved hearing this talk, and again echoing like hearing how it's developed and also like seeing the work. You mentioned a lot of the challenges, but I wanted to see if you had anything to say about something that came to me between both the games, but the empathy that you have for these, like the ethical weight and the ethical concerns, but also like the individuals. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to like the empathy as like a central tenet, and then also if you see any impacts of that like on the main character's story in this second game.
Yeah, that's a good question. As you know, like I wanted to be really intentional um, when it came to comprising the how did I describe it in my I had a very elaborate obsidian for the archive, and so it was all like a web of things. And so for every testimony, as I was like going through, especially I think probably about in the like fourth week of my fellowship, I was like, ooh, I hit a point, and I was like, this is not feeling the way that it should feel. So I think going in, I was trying to not have too much of the interviews be like verbatim, or like any of the text in the archive be verbatim, because then I think that there were so many issues that were presented, but I wanted to go in and really make sure that I was doing my best to honor all of the people that were being a part of this project, because some of these people don't know that they're in this project, and I'm like, then how do I balance that weight? And I think the another fault in the archive is that there's not like a set protagonist. Like you have Cree, like I can see her. You never, because it's first person, you never see you in the archive. There's not a lot of details. Like something that Papers, Please does really well is that you have a family that you have to provide for, and that incentivizes your choices and your actions. And there was not that in the archive. And so I think when it came to making a character like Cree, where people could actually see themselves within her for whatever like reason, whether it be the relation to her family or just her constant choice to want to go and dive into these histories. So when it came to like fostering empathy, it was like, I think it was a character issue, honestly, first. And then when it came to having somebody that you could see that would actually feel for these people, I think that made a really, really big shift in my development process. So shout out to Professor Colin Kelly if you watch this. I'm gonna send the recording to him if he's not. So yeah, but thank you. I don't know if there's online.
We have
Oh, no, go.
go
Online
from
questions.
Zoom from Kurt Borchard, who also echoed many praises about your presentation. They were saying that during the pandemic, they were looking for some interactive online games that would help their students understand topics such as like racism, sexism, and contemporary surveillance. They wanted to know if there were any other types of games besides Papers, Please and Third World Farmer. I don't know if you've heard of that one. Also, that cover topics such as this.
Oh my gosh. I mean, oh, I feel like I'm being put on the spot for my baller game knowledge, right? Oh, I don't know if I would really have to be careful how I say this. There's a game, I think it's called like The Best Week Ever, which is a little controversial, but it takes you through living life as a child named Mitch and I think you're in the 1960s. His mother is a white woman, his father is a black woman, but his father is a black man, and then his mother is his caretaker, but she's ill. And so they're kind of like trying to traverse through this culture at the time, where they're very much in danger of just like racial terror themselves. And so I think that's an interesting game. It was made by, I can't remember what university made it, but they did the voice acting and everything. It's a bit, there's some of the moments in there you're like, oh, I don't know about that, but it is a cool concept. I'd have to do some more research on other games that are encompassing like this, but I think Not for Broadcast is cool, even though it's not necessarily covering the exact topic. I think it has a really cool delivery and feel. Man, I know after this I'm gonna think about it and I'm gonna be like, man, there's so many options here. I mean, even if you want to like get into how Detroit Become Human, Marcus's arc is literally just a civil rights leader, and they're basically making you choose for him to be like an extremist or pacifist, or it's interesting. So yeah.
I also just have a personal question. The trajectory of your project also obviously is very interesting, and I kind of understand the idea that like your professor is coming up with playing with real history and playing with real memory. I just wanted to know like what your family thinks of like the trajectory of the game as well.
Yeah.
And like any input about changing it from the archive to keep with the currents, or just like what they think of it.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's been interesting, like, because my grandparents don't have as much of a concept of like game design as, I feel like my parents and other relatives do. So when I tell my grandfather and my grandmother, oh, I'm working on a game, they're like, oh, cool. And I'll be like, oh, I'll show you when it's done. But I think that the transition from the archive to the Keep of the Currents has been, I think, welcomed. There was not any opposition to the archive initially until I voiced my own opinions about how weird it felt. Because I talk to my grandparents every week, and so sometimes in those weekly talks, I give them updates about how the development is going. And my grandfather was like, well, you just make sure you include these key details in there. He gives me new stuff every week, and I'm like, Grandpa, I can't handle all this updated stuff, but I'm writing it down like furiously. But I think that my family has, in terms of the archive, I think that they were just excited to see all the updates over the summer and to see that there was like an iterative process going on and seeing updates all the time. And then now it's like, I'm writing a lot of stuff. If you guys want to read everything I'm writing, feel free, but there's not a lot of visual unless you include like the slides presentation. So it's a bit different the way that they're receiving the Keep of the Currents, and trying to break down like my whole narrative arc is interesting. So yeah, it's maybe now that some of my family is watching this, so what's up, guys? So maybe now y'all can hit me up with your feedback on what you think of how the Keep of the Currents is going. I know some of you guys were also not aware of the transition yet, so my bad, but please, yes.
I have a question about the interviews that you conducted as well as the ones that you watched in the VHA.
Yes.
And how, like, what order did that come in? Did you interview your family after you had watched testimonies? Did it affect how you approached that conversation? What did you do the same or differently?
Right.
And you were saying, you knew, like, kind of on a cellular level what Mona was describing about this inherited silence.
Yes.
And were there things that you heard from your family that were just so different, like so distinct from what you heard in Holocaust survivor testimonies? Or was it mostly like resonance?
Oh man, that's a okay. No, that's I know that's so much. Okay.
Answer whatever part of you?
Okay, well, I think all of it's really interesting. And I don't remember. I think we might have done the VHA Survivor paper in class before I did the family interviews. I don't really remember. I have to look at the syllabus. But I know that because we had to write a paper. So Fred Rodell was the person that I wrote the Survivor paper on before getting like more into the weeds for the research paper. And there were certain things that I was like looking for, since with the VHA that you can like you have like keywords or like key things that you can look for there. And so what's newer with the Mona Golombek interview, and I just love that, is now that there's like silence. Like I can look for silence in there. Like she has so many pauses and it's wonderful. Okay, but oh, I'm getting off track for the answer to the question. But I think that I did the Fred Rodell interview first, and then I think that kind of did inform how the interviewer just let him speak. And like that's something that I just can't like let go of, because just letting my grandparents like walk me through things and without me always having to guide the conversation, unless they said something that was like, I was like, wait, we just went right by this. Like my grandpa, he was like, I never really thought about that, and he moved on, and I was like, oh wait, grandpa, can we go back to talking about this, because he had so many other stories to tell. And so this is like not even encompassing of everything that was mentioned, but I think that allowed for a lot of things that are even in like the subtext of the Keep of the Currents. Like there's so many things that he's seen or that he never really had an issue with. Something that struck me, I believe this is in my essay, but my great-grandfather asked my grandfather when he was complaining. He came back from college, and my grandfather was like rattling off all these things about the white man this, the white man that. And my great-grandfather goes, what did the white man ever do to you? Right? And so that's something that I was like, wait. And then my grandpa was like, well, yeah, I couldn't really name something specific. And I was like, that's so interesting, because we always, like, I thought he was going to come back with like a strong rebuttal. Well, this happened and that happened. But like directly, he didn't have like a ton of negative experiences despite being in Mississippi. And even when I interviewed my maternal grandmother, Mildred, when I told her I was interviewing my grandpa, she was like, ooh, Mississippi is bad. I was like, oh, thank you, grandma. Thank you for that one. So it's just interesting to see how it's all like interconnected. So there were certain things that they said that I definitely was surprised by. And then I think that hit me a little maybe harder than some of the VHA interviews, just because of the closer personal connection. So yeah, there's still things. And so hopefully when my grandma watches this, she'll let me interview her again. So we'll see. Oh yeah, what's up? What's up, Paige?
Hi. I loved your description of that one scene from Keep of the Currents. I feel like it was so powerful, and I could visualize it and see like how it sort of brought together all the changes you made and how you were thinking about this. I'm curious what your plans are in the future for like continuing to work on this project.
Yes. So many plans. I want to actually like finish the narrative first, because it is obviously like a narrative driven game. And then there's so many people that I've just reached out to along the way, from fellow developers to my professors, who have been so wonderful in giving me inspiration. Like, so right now my plan is to finish the narrative before I get into like trying to actually be in an engine. And then it's like, ooh, do I want this to be an Unreal project? Nobody's going to want to work with me if it's an Unreal project. So, my USC game students do prefer Unity. So that's something too. But there's so many, I think, people that would be willing to just be like, yeah, let's work on this. Even with, there's the Melanated Game Kitchen, which is a really, really awesome organization that brings together melanated developers. And so I've also got some really cool conversations going there for when like full development is going. But right now it's just me trying to finish the narrative and then running this by my fellows, and then also like family members, just all of that, and as many people as I can, to make sure that this feels like a really well-rounded experience. Even reaching out, like, oh my gosh, there's so many cool people that have just really informed my process from, oh my goodness. I can't start name dropping people, because then if I name drop people and I forget somebody, I'm going to feel so bad. But you know who you are if you see this. So just narrative, and then we'll hopefully get into development sometime really soon. Soon is debatable, but soon.
Someone in the Q&A is asking if they can play the archive somewhere.
I mean, if you want to play the archive, I can put it up on like itch for you. So I'll put it on itch.
There's also a family review from mom and dad
Aw.
about Keeper of the Currents.
Oh, what did my
Mom
parents?
and dad love the Keeper of the Currents.
Oh, thank you, mom and dad.
And Renette Brooks.
Oh, yeah, what's up?
I love the Keeper of the Currents. Your family is proud of you.
Oh, thank you guys. Thank you guys.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, cool.
Well, please join me in thanking.
Thank you guys.
It was incredible and very poetic. The center's director, Wolf Gruner, and I had a little chat, and he says he can hear the poet, which I think is so true.
It's always persistent.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can never get rid of it.
And thank you all for coming. Please take food to go with you. We have to-go containers back there. And to those of you on Zoom, thank you for being here. Please join us next Wednesday at noon on Zoom for a lecture about contested narratives before, during, and after genocide in Rwanda, in Guatemala, and with the Rohingya crisis in 2017. Thank you so much.